Welcome to the Intrazone, a show about the Microsoft 365 Intelligent Intranet. I'm Mark Cashman, and
I'm Chris McNulty. Today, we'll be talking with Alexander Bradley. He's a senior product marketing manager, which means he runs the narrative for all things that relate to teamwork, and he heads up all of our modern workplace storytelling.
Yeah, we're going to talk to him about the latest efforts that Microsoft is doing to respond to the crisis, how we're helping our customers adjust to the remote workforce, really what's on the Microsoft 365 roadmap horizon that's adjusted most recently because of the crisis, and really the focus of what he is driving as a narrative behind, of course, everything that we're doing in the service, in the product to respond based on customer requests, to reduce costs, to manage risk, and we'll certainly spend time with him about what we are, not just peers because we work at Microsoft, but he is also a fellow podcaster. I didn't know if you knew that, Chris. He has the Modern Workplace podcast.
It is a very interesting time to be talking about the nature of work because if COVID-19 has taught us anything, it's that just work has changed irrevocably. I think we are learning better ways to work, that people are going to continue to adopt as the crisis hopefully subsides. What's your take on it, Mark?
Personally, I remember the first week, I would reference maybe by saying, I've worked from home before. I certainly have a setup if I need to stay home for something that's going on around the house or with the kids or just in the nature of taking a day from home instead of commuting. So that initial transition, but then to see everybody that we work with, including customers and partners, adjusting and gravitating to newer technologies or other technologies. It doesn't always have to be Microsoft, but being pulled into a lot of calls, a lot of different tech, and just adjusting to, getting work done when you can, because the balance of working from home has moved some of that. And I know that there are certainly other challenges, but that balance of working from home is, there are other things going on at when you are at home and just focusing on those. But I'm curious with you, whether it's work or life oriented, what's changed for you when you look at the response that you've had to go through because of the changes?
One thing I have found myself doing that's a little bit different in my work practice, since we've been home, it's interesting, the phenomenon of recorded Teams meetings. I struggle with those sometimes a little bit because if I didn't have time to go to it when it was happening, why would I have time the next day? Because that's going to also be a busy day. But I'm trying to, usually once a week, if there are meetings that I would like to listen to, I'll take advantage of the fact that because they're played through stream, you can play them at 1.5 or double speed. On one of the rare occasions where we have to run an errand, I'll just go to my car, still socially isolated, and just listen to the recording, whether I have to run an errand or not.
Yeah, the ability to go back, obviously, in any setting is a great thing. I know because a lot of meetings are now online, and there are some that you can't attend because you get double booked or that just you focus on other things. And I think both the technology supports to be able to refer back or go back if you miss something, but also the notion of you don't have to technically be there, and people are aware that there's reasons different than they were before of why you maybe couldn't make a meeting, or maybe you couldn't stay to the last 30 minutes and you'll catch up offline. It was a thing I think I heard a lot of people say, I'll catch up later. Reality is now you maybe more need to and can, which is really good. So I think one thing, just to set a little context, you're probably going to hear one name when we talk to Alex, and that's Jared Spataro. He is our corporate vice president in Microsoft 365 marketing, and he's been on the front line, literally. He's been on TV. He's been on a lot of blogs that people have read if they're interested in what Microsoft is doing, what Microsoft 365 is adjusting to support customers, in this change. We'll reference Jared because he's been on Alex's show a couple of times, so great insights coming from the Modern Workplace, a lot of connection between what Alex and Jared are sharing out to the world.
And I would also observe internally, as Jared's been communicating with Mark and myself during the crisis, he brings these really insightful ways of thinking about COVID-19. In particular, that not just the nature of work has changed, but it's a terrible reason why this is happening. But in some ways, this virus can be turned into a small gift, just in that it is an opportunity to kind of look 360 degrees around and say, just because we've been doing things a certain way before may not be a good reason to continue doing them. And a chance to do this kind of rethink, I think, points the path forward out of this, and figuring out how do we individually and collectively emerge from this stronger and more resilient.
Yeah, I agree. I think there is a unification outcome. I think we're in the middle of it. I see it at work with just feeling more connected with what other people are doing, even disconnected, in person. But I will thank today that you and I get to connect because I always enjoy working with you. But before we get started, I just wanted to ask you one really, really important topical question. Did you hear that the Buccaneers plan to rename their city to Tampa Bay?
I did hear that. I don't think it's actually going to happen, but Tampa Bay and TB12, that sort of seemed so obvious. I can't imagine they didn't think of it sooner.
I hope so. Well, I want to credit the little joke to Peter Sagal and the Wait, Don't Tell Me crew, but I thought it was on point for when I talk to Chris McNulty next.
Up next, we're welcoming Alex Bradley here to the Intro Zone. Alex, thanks for coming in to sit down with us.
Thanks so much for having me.
And are you sitting down or are you standing up? Because on the COVID internet, no one can tell where you are.
I am sat down at my dining room table, which is a bit of a change because back in the office, I have one of those fancy standing desks. So I'm not that fancy yet at home.
Understood.
Give us a little bit more about who you are and the role that you play at Microsoft so then we can start to land some of the topics that I think people are really interested in that you have in your head.
Definitely. Well, I've been with Microsoft. It was 15 years in January. I started on the college graduate scheme in the United Kingdom. Back then, it was a rotation program, and I did one rotation with an account team, and then my second rotation was as a portals specialist, and this is back in 2005. And other than a brief sojourn with one of our former managers who went across to Azure, my entire time at the company has been sort of within productivity. So I never looked back from that first portals SSP role. I actually came off the grad scheme early into a full-time I think it was called Information Worker Solutions Specialist role. And I did that for a couple of years. And then in 2008, I was fortunate enough to come across and join the team that introduced BPOS, or the Business Productivity Online Suite, into the market. And I joined the day after Bill Gates announced the beta version. And I say announced because he didn't release it. So when I joined, we had no service in no countries with no users. And so being part of that journey of figuring out like how you were going to bring this to market and then rebranding it from BPOS to Office 365, et cetera, et cetera. And then I did that little brief surge into Azure. And then when I came back, I joined the Microsoft Teams team. And I've been a part of the Microsoft 365 marketing team for the last year or so.
Very nice. So you were on a sunny day when there wasn't a cloud, and now there is a big giant cloud and you're a big part of it.
A giant cloud. And it's funny, when I moved over, first of all, in customer meetings, you would have to have the conversation around what is the cloud and come to a common understanding of what the cloud was back in 2008. And people were just adamant that it wasn't going to be particularly big. Or I know some people internally were like puzzled, like why would you join that team versus going and joining the Office team or something? And so with hindsight, I don't think there was any great prescience on my part. I was just fortunate to be in a great place at a great time and having been a part of the last sort of decade or so and the amazing journey that we've all been on.
Let me ask you a little bit, because I think you have a unique perspective, both as a translator and as someone who has gone through their own transformation and change management during the past 15 years and observing it for Microsoft. We are working both in micro scale and macro scale at massively accelerated timelines. And many organizations who had deferred moves to cloud or moves to adopt digital transformation, we've seen all of that basically mash down on the gas pedal just in the past 7 weeks. What has Microsoft been doing to help our customers, to help the world respond to the current COVID crisis?
Well, first of all, I think it's important to point out that we've been on that same journey along with, everybody else. So I'd say that there have been significant learnings over that time and an evolution of response. I'd also point out, like Satya has used the phrase digital first responders, and it shouldn't take anything away from the fantastic people who are first responders in our communities. But as we hear from our customers, they are looking to us to help support them, in this time. And increasingly that's been with these cloud technologies. So I'd say there have been a few specific things that we've done. First of all, trying really almost to over communicate. So sharing out what we're hearing, learnings, best practices. We pivoted from more involved pieces of advice. And I'll give you a really good example. The Teams team introduced something called the Art of Teamwork several months ago. And this was a curriculum that was co-created with IDEO. And it was all about how do you stimulate teamwork in your organization. And that's fantastic. But what we learned in this crisis was that people needed more specific, immediate, actionable pieces of content. So it's not that the need for the Art of Teamwork goes away, but the team very quickly pivoted into 10 things to set up secure remote teamwork, 10 things to make your webcasts better, 10 things to help working parents from home. So pivoting into that much more immediate sort of crisis, response frame of mind. So that's one thing. And then I'd say looking at the offers that are out there. So recognizing that cloud technologies are really how people are helping adapt. We put out an offer so that there's a 6-month free SKU, as it's called, of Office 365 that people can use to get up and running as quickly as possible.
I think a big part of the initial focus to Chris's question in your answer was, how do you respond to something like this? It's monumental. There's a lot of things in place, but it also requires things that aren't in place, processes that aren't set. As we peer down the road a little bit further, and it's on a timeline that nobody can dictate, even though a lot of people have perspectives and hopes. But how do people move from that response phase to think then around recovery, in how we're helping promote that, support it, maybe with the norms of the cloud? If you haven't fully adopted them, there's some natural things that we can look to around cost reduction and managing risk. But what does that new normal look like, either how you're hearing or describing it or hearing other people describe it based on the realities that they're seeing from our customers? Yeah,
I think that's really interesting. And what I've observed and the way that I see us sort of preparing for this is, definitely the notion of 3 phases. There's the immediate crisis, response phase. And I think increasingly you don't see us sort of saying crisis. It's just like where we are right now. And so there's the immediate response. Then there's the restarting of the economy. And then there's the reshaping and the opportunity to kind of change the profile. And so one of the things that I think has been interesting is in this sort of digital first responder mode is the notion of, hey, I work for Microsoft 365, so that's the only thing that I care about. It kind of goes out the window. The company response has very much been at the Microsoft level. So what we've heard is that there are basically 5 scenarios that, hey, we're here to help. One is around enabling remote teamwork. One is around how do you do that securely? One is around enabling remote sales and service. Another is around how you can rapidly change business processes and adopt automation with things like Power Platform. And last is how do you keep developers, up and productive? And so you don't see Azure going out and doing, a bunch of different marketing efforts. You don't see Dynamics 365 going out and doing a bunch of different marketing efforts, or for that matter, Microsoft 365. The company is focused on those 5 things. What I'm seeing is that those 5 things don't go away as we move into that restart and reshape phase. We might add others, especially around, say, Azure, for example, but there will be an increased focus on how we can help customers consolidate and, reduce costs whilst focusing in on these sort of core scenarios that are essential to not only survival in a very real way, and then also adapting to this sort of new normal.
Hearing you say that, I know one thing that we've been talking about internally. I know in some of our internal meetings that you've been part of, that Jared Spataro's been part of, understanding that evolution from crisis to coming out of it, restarting the economy is going to vary by job function, by industry, by country, by technology. How have you seen that playing out in some of your dialogue you're having with the outside world?
Playing out in what regard?
That there are still parts of the world that are very much in crisis response mode. How do I continue to get people to work from home? And other people in other parts of the world that are starting to say, okay, we're sustaining this, but now we're ready for the next phase, which is how do we use these tools and build on remote work to be able to restart our economy and our operations?
I think what I'm experiencing is that people are coming to terms and accepting that there may be a level of nuance and difference. Maybe we're not as used to. And what I mean by that is you just articulated very well the fact that this journey is going to look a little bit different for companies, different countries, different regions, whereas we're used to, hey, I'm going to roll out a campaign. Everybody's going to get it at the same time. That might not be the world that we live in for the next year, 18 months, just recognizing that some, countries like Australia or New Zealand right now, they are ostensibly COVID-free, whereas others are still in the thick of it. So having to adapt and respond differently to different markets, different companies, different segments, and being okay with that versus having a nicely, a beautiful PowerPoint that rolls out and, everything is treated equally in the same. I think there's just a sense of recognizing a need for greater agility, both on our part and then also recognizing that that's what our customers are being faced with as well.
So I think there's customer expectation that not only is changed and may recover or come out changed as it recovers. There's obviously varying timelines and the needs may be different as you described. We want to talk about the podcast that you do in just a second. I think before we get to really what is the podcast about and tell us about some of those discussions with Jared, you focus a lot on the roadmap. And I think it's an interesting point to consider at this point in time. What does the roadmap look like after? We knew what it was 3 or 4 months ago because we've been working on it. But now certain things will just continue as they were because they were planned, important, and very relevant still. Things maybe got bumped up in priority based on now this remote work and a lot of people changing their behaviors and that transformation sort of is here kind of notion. Because you talk at the Microsoft 365 often, what are you seeing are some of the key changes in the roadmap that are in sort of in that response to COVID?
The wonderful thing about the technology that we work with today is how responsive it can be to market needs. Now, in the past, that could be a specific customer or industry requiring certain feature sets, and we're able to sort of be agile and get them into the roadmap and adapt. Obviously, at the moment, we're faced with a much bigger sort of impetus for change. But because we're no longer in that world of 3-year on-premises server client release schedules, we can be much more agile. And so I'd say, before getting into any specifics, I'd say as a result, we can refactor and reprioritize in real time. And I would say that the biggest thing that I would take away is this notion of not only remote everything, but the fact that there has been now this sort of democratization of remoteness. And what I mean by that is we had always built features in, I'll use Teams as the example, to enable remote work. But I think frequently for those people who spent most or the majority of their time in the office, it was always not really an afterthought, but you'd be in a room and you'd have 6 or 8 people in a room and you might have 1 or 2 people on Teams, and they were always slightly the poor relations. And so I think this, as I say, the democratization of being remote is, I think when we go back to work, whatever that looks like, I'm not sure that we'll be going back in the same way. I think people will take some learnings from this current experience. And so that necessitating that need for, really bringing sort of remote participants in and making that much more a part of how the tools are built. And so that then has an impact in terms of that prioritization, how you think about things. Everything from, the physical hardware, with Microsoft Teams room systems or even Surface devices, and then through to which features get prioritized that we build into the products. So I'd say that's like the first sort of macro takeaway.
Yeah, it's interesting to hear you say that. I mean, I've been thinking a little bit about, what's the nature of remote work. And I'm watching for the linguistic shift where we just start describing remote work as work and start describing centralized work as something else. There was an article that I ran into this week that was published in early January in the Wall Street Journal. David Duane is a workplace architect, a literal bricks and mortar workplace architect. And he had almost an anticipation of this. He spent years at Gensler, and he was coming up with better ways to construct digital physical workplaces, which included individualized work pods to create better isolation, with a lot of questions about, is an open office the best way for people to be able to be productive when they need to isolate? And I think it's really fascinating to think about all the ways that the digital and physical world is going to just reinvent over the next 12 months, 24 months, and we get to watch that unfold.
Yeah, I mean, the CEO, I think, of Barclays, or in the last day or two, has already said that, he sees their need for their real estate portfolio changing. I was speaking to the CEO of one of our agencies who also produces a magazine, and they're very interesting. They have their leases up on their building in London, and so they'd been looking to just move to another building. And he was saying that he's fundamentally rethinking what they need from a space perspective. So rather than just replacing office building for office building, well, he's now thinking maybe we go to a townhouse and I have a small group of people on the upper floors who are working away, but then the sub-editors are now based in Bangkok, and downstairs there's a cafe, where people, guests can come in and whatnot. So you're really fundamentally changing their use of space. So I think we're going to see a lot of that.
I liked what you both said around what I think of as accommodating for those that are there or those that aren't, or the new space, and how does it work best for what you're actually trying to accomplish. And Alex, when you were talking about roadmap, the two features that just sort of started to resonate that support that, and I think also just through the lens of they were on the backlog, they got accelerated, was just that, to support people who are not in the room. And if the go forward is more people still won't be in the room for a period of time, or because people adjust to that. The notion was always the people in the room had to accommodate for the people who were remote. You had to make sure that they are included, which is, of course, just good practice. But you just technically have to ask them, do you have anything to add? You can't see their facial expressions, or you can't see them raising their hand. But now being able to see more faces and the raise the hand feature, I think accommodate just a better experience for when somebody's remote, whether it's one or everybody. So I really like that, what you both were saying around the physical spaces, or even just the notion of digital, accommodating the new norm, which may be just something that has betterment, not just because it's in crisis mode, but because a lot of people, may need to just stay at home or be at home, but be as included as possible.
Definitely. And so this podcast is coming out in May. And later in the month after the podcast is released, there is the Microsoft Build conference that's coming up. And Build is our annual developer sort of focused conference. So it's not like an Ignite for IT pros or decision makers. But it is interesting because, first of all, not only is Build moving to a virtual model, which is an interesting challenge in and of itself, but it's also an opportunity to kind of change how we do keynotes, which is kind of fun. So I'm working on that at the moment. And I mentioned that for two reasons. First of all, to sort of talk about the experience. And then secondly, maybe to, give a highlight to some of the areas where we'll sort of see some advances. First of all, from the keynote format, I think everybody listening who's ever been to a tech conference is familiar with, people up on stage doing a demo. It's 60 minutes, it's 75 minutes. Sometimes it's 90 minutes, but we're rethinking that. So we're actually saying the core team gave us an hour, and we've actually tried to get ours down to half an hour, and we're treating it like a television show. And so there's no segment that is more than 2 minutes. And because you're treating it like a television show, you can do things like speeding up demo portions. Here's one I made earlier, all of those sort of things. So I think that's really interesting, and it's an opportunity to do something different. And so that's pretty awesome. And then
before you move on, I'm just really curious. Do you think you're going to get picked up for a season 2 for this TV show?
I actually really do. And I mean that very genuinely, because it's funny. I've been having these conversations with colleagues, and you've mentioned Modern Workplace, which is the sort of the monthly webcast and podcast that I do. So I've had experience of building these webcasts for a little while. And I've been helping colleagues come to understand what some of these opportunities are. And it definitely takes a little bit of time for people to get out of that mindset of, that keynote, like, I'm going to do my demo. My demo is 6 minutes, here you go. It happened with one team just last week where we finished a production sort of meeting. And this is the team that was maybe the hardest to get over that mindset barrier. Not because they were anti it, but it was just difficult. They hadn't been through that journey before. And at the end of the meeting, they were like, oh, this is awesome. This is this is easier, because they realized that they can pre-record it. They can do it again and again. They can go into edit. They can change things. They can shorten things. And so I think once we've been through this, and this gets back to this point of like, it's not going to go back to business as usual. Do we want to go back to a world of 75-minute keynotes at Ignite? Maybe, but I don't think they're going to look the same as they used to. So I do think there'll be a season 2.
It's interesting. I've spent a lot of my career at conferences, Mark, as we all have. Something that I've heard said before is, what learnings are we going to take from the digital world back when we reweave any sort of live event? Like you mentioned 75 minutes. Does it make sense for every breakout session at a conference to be 75 minutes long? Maybe not. We know with people's attention spans, the fact that you should only be delivering things to people in these bite-sized chunks when they're remote, locking people in a room doesn't necessarily change their attention span all that much either. So it'll be really fascinating to watch what we're going to learn over the next year and how that influences all modes of interaction. We've talked about it a bit. We've alluded to it. I want to make sure we reserve a little bit of time to talk about the Modern Workplace podcast.
Before we do that, though, let me give you one thing, because I think on the feature roadmappy stuff, the thing that I'd love to signpost for people, and it's more important than ever with the world that we live in right now, and it's this underlying technology called the Microsoft Graph. Everybody might be familiar with Teams, Word, Excel, PowerPoint, even like SharePoint or Yammer, but underneath all of that, think about, I call it like productivity exhaust. Every time you open up a document or you send an email, who you collaborate with, all of this sort of information that's sort of out there. And in a world in which you're using a sort of smorgasbord of sort of best of breed apps, that productivity exhaust is just going up into the ether. Whereas if you're using Microsoft 365, it's instantiated in this thing called Microsoft Graph. And we can build on top of that. And we do that with things like focus time. So my calendar actually reserves focus time for me ahead of time, anticipating when I might get busy. That's a great example of how it's providing value to me. But developers can also use it. So the reason I wanted to highlight that is because I think it's of interest to people who are in technology or people making decisions about what tools they want to use in this new world of work. And this is one that is kind of like a secret weapon that can help us when we're not in the same room together.
I'm going to reflect back a little bit of what we've been hearing about is, part of my day job is as director of marketing for Project Cortex, which is our knowledge and content platform, which we'll be launching later this year. It works on Graph, and it's interesting in the discussions about Graph, we make the assumption that the Graph is one of these transformational technologies that people will be interested in hearing about later on. But the discussions that we have are surprisingly focused on, we can't get these capabilities in soon enough because it's also helpful for restarting and also tremendously helpful for remote work. So, I just am amplifying the stuff that you're saying about the Graph.
Absolutely. And that sort of brings us to what do I think makes a modern workplace? It's leveraging these sort of technologies. I think going into this crisis, I would still meet with, and again, we have to stop saying, crisis. It's just the world that we live in now. But you'd still meet with customers who, when you talk to them and you ask them, like, are you still emailing files around? And you get that sort of like, oh, yeah, we're still emailing files around. Are you still using file shares? Yep, still using file shares. And so the notion of a modern workplace to me is when you are leveraging these sort of transformative technologies, Microsoft 365 being one, but leveraging that sort of power of the graph, building on top of it, because there are REST APIs that people can use to build into their own applications, whether that's an internal application, or developers. And so when I think about what a modern workplace is, it is this sort of an environment.
So as Chris was alluding to, we want to talk shop just for a second. We're on a podcast. You've got your own podcast. Can you tell us a little bit more, to our audience, what is the Modern Workplace, both your video side and the audio side, and maybe take us through your recent episode, which I think is very topical to what we've been discussing, which is the episode 1 month in, what we've learned about remote work, where you were talking with Jared Spataro. But give us a summary of what the show's all about, and then maybe kind of give us a sense of what that episode was about, what people can expect when they listen to it.
Yeah, thank you. Well, Modern Workplace is a long-standing monthly webcast, and it's been going for about 5 years. We don't necessarily do one every single month. We'll go on hiatus in the summer and whatnot. But for anyone who knows Microsoft, the notion of a monthly marketing effort that's been going for 5 years is pretty insane. I'm pretty proud of that. And its genesis was, how do we have more of a conversation with, back then we'd sort of call them business decision makers. We felt very, very good at our ability to talk to technology leaders. And really, we wanted to broaden the conversation out. And I'd say that's as true today as it was back then. So we pick topics that are of general business interest and then try and break them down in a very approachable, very television-centric manner. And to that end, we've actually had several Emmy nominations for the show over the years, which is a testament to the work of many, many, many people on the show.
I'd say congratulations. And if I was just joking about a season 2, you really are on a season 5 and thinking about 6. That's awesome.
Again, really, I mean, it's exciting. I get to talk to fascinating people. Everyone in previous seasons, from Teresa Payton, who was a former White House Chief Information Security Officer, through to Gary Vaynerchuk, Maria Bartiromo, interesting people. Right now, we've been focused on the last few months. We've been obviously, tailoring it to sort of Microsoft 365. And it has this ability to sort of shapeshift a little bit, because we did 2 episodes on the art of teamwork that I kind of alluded to. One that was on the theory, and then one that was in practice. And we actually went, and this is the taping that we did in Manhattan. We went on site with Wunderman Thompson, which is one of the WPP agencies, to see how they do teamwork. So for the most recent episode that just went live this week, we focused it in on remote work. And so in the space of 55 days, my goodness, the world has changed. We were on site, and now we're all recording from home. So we actually created these production fly kits, so we weren't just relying on webcams. And we asked Jamie, who's the CIO of Wunderman Thompson, to come on the show again and create this bridge from, where we were physically together in Manhattan to the fact that, Jamie's now, in his basement. Jared's in his home office. So I really love how it sort of pivoted, and we now have these production fly kits. So we're going to continue that. And I actually think for the next month or two, rather than picking an individual topic, we're actually going to highlight some customer stories. So I'm actually taping, I should say, with a film festival that was actually meant to be an in-person film festival in Chattanooga last month. And they've figured out, what does it mean to be a virtual film festival? How can people watch and then participate in some of the activities? So that's the first one that we're recording this week. And there's a bunch more lined up. So that's what you're going to see from the Modern Workplace in the next few months, both podcasts and videos of these customer conversations.
That's really cool. I mean, you certainly adjust to how you capture. So I heard you say you're sending kits, imagining microphones and video, so that people can capture as best they can, record locally, send you the files, I can imagine. But coordinating all of that, there's a lot of not on-site activity with email and scheduling and whatever goes into it. It's a stretch to learn, I think, a little bit. Your trade, the questions, they know their stuff, but there's at some point that getting used to it, that's quite an adjustment.
It is, but there are also benefits, because rather than putting people on a studio, on a stage with a lot of lights and a lot of people surrounding them, which a lot of people are very unaccustomed to, and even if you are accustomed to it, there's an artificiality to it. Whereas when you're recording at home, you're in hopefully a safe, comfortable space. So I think it is a little bit different. And so I'd encourage people, this is the plug section, go to modernworkplace.com. You can see this current remote work episode. And we actually start the episode with a really fun montage of people setting up the kit. So it's like this big Pelican case that arrives, and it's got 2 cameras. I have them set up, one as like a scene camera and then one as a profile camera closer in. And we set up the scene camera and get that rolling first. And so it's just really kind of fun seeing, how people, adapt. So you can see that at modernworkplace.com. It's also on YouTube. Just search Microsoft Modern Workplace.
I love it. You said one of my most comfort words or phrases, Pelican case.
Pelican case.
Those things are the most amazing things. I have one question for both of you. Before we wrap up here, I know one commonality between the 3 of us, besides working at Microsoft, is that we each have dogs in the home. Might I ask both of you, what is your dog doing right now?
Sleeping and snoring. And you might have heard, actually, we were talking before we hit the record button about how she then goes and chases squirrels in her sleep. She has been doing that through this podcast.
That's awesome. Chris?
Mine is sleeping by the back door, which is a reminder that I need to let him out once we're done with today's podcast.
And I'll just tell you, I don't want this to reflect on our conversation, but the dog in the room was awake at the beginning of our conversation, is now comfortably sleeping.
Well, if we can be a salve for today's woes and sort of a lullaby for the dog, I'll take it. I'm fine with that.
That's great. Well, Alex, we want to thank you for your time. Our very last question for you is just a quick one. As you are in this new state of working from home, being at home, what is the most comforting thing, either entertainment or food, that you didn't turn to before, but you now turn to?
I think for me, it's playing cards. And, so I'm quarantining with my partner, and we've actually been making time to stop and make a cocktail at the end of the day and shuffle some cards and just play some cards. And that was something that we just didn't do before. We used to do it on holiday maybe, but it's become part of our sort of daily sort of sundowner ritual. And I've really been appreciating that.
Yeah, it's funny you mentioned that. We've been doing something very similar here with my partner and her 18-year-old son. I would say 4 to 5 nights a week, Brendan will come in with an Uno game or some other card game, and we'll just sit around for 2 hours doing that.
It's nice.
It's one of the things. There are a lot of things I hope we don't lose from this time.
Yeah. Connecting with people. So I lived in a house at university with, some people who are still to this day my closest friends, and I'm godfather to several of their children. And it's great. When I've been going back to the UK, I get to see them occasionally, maybe once or twice a year maximum. But the last few weeks, we've been having, if not weekly, then every other week, virtual, drinks, getting together and chatting. And that's something that we never did before. So, yeah, you're right. I think, and I hope that there are things that we continue as things hopefully get back to a little bit more normal.
I hope so, too. And for today, want to thank you for your time. Thank you for your generosity to share what you know and certainly explain, some of the things that are behind it. We wish you luck not only to continue into season 6 of The Modern Workplace, but with the podcast kind of getting up and, you've got great company with Jared Spataro. I've listened to a couple of them. It's really nice conversations. So thanks for putting that stuff out there, and thanks for joining us today.
No, thank you so much for having me. And we'd love to have the Intrazone folks come and join us as well over at modernworkplace.com.
Absolutely.
Thanks.
Thanks again, and take care. Up next, it's time for Mark and I to take a look at upcoming events. These have all gone digital. Some have gone galactic. So, Mark, what are some of the events that we know that are coming up in the next couple of weeks?
Yeah, the one that's probably pretty front and center for anybody that's a developer out there is Build. Build is now May 19th through the 20th. It's completely digital and it's completely free. And Chris and I have gotten a good view into what they're planning. It is not just sessions that you click into and view. It's going to be a real immersive experience, a lot of content, a lot of news. They really are being mindful of how are people going to be able to connect with both the information, people, and have that community aspect as if you're on the show floor.
And we'll have some news about Project Cortex. There's other news that we can't even tell you about that Mark is working on. So it's going to definitely be something to stay engaged with.
Chris and I have 3 other online events that our third-party event partners are putting on. and they all have a lot of different variety, different scale, but certainly a lot of great content, a lot of great speakers. The first one, May 27th through the 28th, is the Microsoft 365 Virtual Marathon, and this takes into consideration some of the planning that we were doing for the in-person SharePoint conference event, but it certainly includes all of our MVPs, a lot of great content, and we'll make sure to have a link in the show notes so that you not only can read about it, but join in. It's a great event, great event planners behind it.
And right after that, on June 2nd and 9th, the Galactic Collaboration Summit, which if you go to their website, it helpfully notes that it will be held within the Milky Way galaxy. For those of you who were planning on heading to Andromeda for that, you can stay at home and watch the Galactic Collaboration Summit.
I think there's still enough time to get to Andromeda if people do want to go, though.
Yeah, but, the whole Einsteinian time dilation thing, you'll be 2 million years old by the time you get there.
The final event that we want to highlight is from our event planning partners and community members over in the UK, but it's certainly a worldwide event, June 15th through June 19th, so it's a fairly long online event. They've done it before. It was GlobalCon 1. This one is called GlobalCon 2. And again, they have a lot of great planning. This one's probably the most variety across not just Microsoft 365 apps and services, but they will have a focus on Azure. They will have a focus on Windows and developers, IT pros, really across the gamut. One summary just in terms of all these last three events, the third-party events, is Microsoft is participating in all of them. Our MVPs are participating even more. And we are also having support from Jeff Teeper. So if you want to hear the latest from Jeff and what he and his team are planning at a broad level, he certainly now covers not only OneDrive and SharePoint and Office, but he also now looks after Teams. So he'll have a lot to share and a great place to plug in if you want to hear what Jeff and team are working on in terms of announcements and recent developments. And across the board, a lot of great use and training across all of the events.
And for our listeners, I would want to note that the best way to stay informed about upcoming events is always going to be what, Mark?
It sounds like not fly out to Andromeda because you might miss a few things.
Of course, we want you to be right here in the podcast. If you have an event, we'll feature it in an upcoming event. We also, through Project Cortex, have started a customer-facing newsletter that is going out about every 2 weeks, and we try to summarize upcoming events. And these 4 were in the last issue of our newsletter. So if you just go to aka.ms/Project Cortex and sign up to receive more information, some of the information that we'll be sending you will be upcoming events. So another tip that you can use to keep your dance card full. Well, thanks to Alex. Thanks, Mark. We'll put links to everything Alex mentioned, including how to find his podcast on Modern Workplace. Greatly appreciate his making time to sit down with us today.
Check out our show page at aka.ms/theinterzone.
If you're curious about other Microsoft programs like Modern Workplace and more, visit us at aka.ms/Microsoft/podcasts and find a new show today.
As always, you can email us at theinterzone@microsoft.com or find us on Twitter at SharePoint, at mcashman, and at cmcnulty2000.
Now, word of mouth is still the best way people learn about podcasts. So if you enjoy this show, help us help more people. Share the SharePoint love and subscribe at your local Galaxy or wherever you get your podcasts.
We are your hosts, Mark Cashman and Chris McNulty, and you've been listening to The Interzone, a show about the Microsoft 365 modern working, always working modernly, intelligent intranet.